Okay, we're going to talk about MIDI on this video. MIDI stands for Musical Instrument Digital Interface. And if you remember one thing from all of this, I want you to remember that MIDI is not audio. MIDI is a communication protocol. It was designed originally to allow synthesizers to speak to each other. And within the MIDI specification, there's information on hardware and information on messages, the structure of the data. But again, MIDI messages do not contain audio. They only contain instructions to create or recreate the audio via a synthesizer. And we'll talk about how all that works in a little bit, but let's get some history first. So before we had MIDI, we had synthesizers. In the 60s and 70s, these analog synthesizers generated sound via continuous electrical voltages. So there were audio voltages, and then there were control voltages that you could use to control aspects of the audio. With them being modular, that means the sound production was split into modules. So you had an oscillator, something that generated the signal, filter that sort of colored the signal, and then an amplifier, which makes an envelope, the volume of the signal over time. And so this actually works very similarly to how most acoustic instruments work. For instance, even my voice, my vocal folds are oscillating, generating the signal. And, my nasal cavity and head and chest are filtering the signal to give it its tone color. And as I send air or stop air through my vocal folds, you get sound or no sound. So that sort of functions like the amplifier in this context. So these things could be big with lots of patch cords. And like I said a minute ago, they're voltage controlled. So that meant if you had, say, if you wanted to change the filter on an EQ or the frequency point on a filter or an EQ, sending a certain voltage to the control frequency on that filter would change where the frequency was, or to the control signal input, rather. This got really interesting because you could also then send control values to audio outputs and make them do lots of weird things. So you had something that looked like this. This might be a bit of an exaggeration, but things that look like that. And you could patch things together to get different sounds. So some of the problems we have with this are that you just don't have enough hands, right? If you want to control more than 2 parameters at a time, you need more than 2 hands. And usually at least one of them would be playing the keyboard. Also, there's no way to really remember the setup. If I wanted to get the same sound I had yesterday, I have to go back in and plug the thing back in the way it was plugged in before. And some of these even came with sheets where you could draw out what was patched together and where the knobs were set and do it all by hand. But that was a bit of a problem. So the first solution for this was to have digital control of analog synthesizers. So instead of having all of these analog controls, we could digitally control the parameters. Also let us store presets. So we're still generating the sound in that sort of analog modular space with those types of oscillators and things. But we can save the parameters and send some control voltage signals through some digital control. To actually do digital synthesis early on, you needed room-sized computers to actually do all the calculation of the audio. But that got a lot cheaper. By the early 80s, digital synthesis was cheap enough that you could do it in a sort of pro-consumer market. And this is a pretty 80s looking digital synthesis setup. You see there like a Yamaha DX7 in that Ensoniq keyboard. Those were both pretty standard. So this was digital control and digital synthesis. And in situations that didn't cost $30,000, right? Like you could buy a DX7. I want to say, I don't even remember. It was over $1,000, but it was not $30,000, right? So this opened up the door for MIDI. So the problem that MIDI solved was there were lots of different manufacturers making lots of different synthesizers, but you couldn't control one with the other unless they were from the same manufacturer. You couldn't layer the sounds unless they were from the same place. So, and one of the few times in the history of the music industry where everybody said, let's play nice together, some people got together and invented MIDI. So MIDI 1.0 came out in 1983, and it was actually published by the International MIDI Association. And what it is it's essentially an open protocol that allows synthesizers to talk to each other. So you could take an Oberheim synth and a Roland synth and a Yamaha synth and connect them all via MIDI and use the sounds from one layered with the sounds from another, or control them from one and use the sounds of the other two. It let everything work together. It was very quickly adopted industry-wide. And soon computers kind of joined that world with Personal Composer in 83. And then not long after, a program called Sequencer that was made by Opcode. And these allowed us to start controlling these MIDI keyboards with computers, or using computers to store some of this information. So in the protocol, there's some hardware specifications. Controllers, modules, keyboard synths, and workstations. So controllers only send MIDI messages. It's just, actually, I have one here. I should probably edit that out, but I might leave it in just for fun. So this is a controller. It doesn't make any sounds on its own, but if I plug it into the computer, it will send MIDI messages with the knobs and buttons. And that's coming up in a later video. So a module receives the MIDI message and outputs sound. A keyboard synthesizer is essentially a controller and a module in one device. So this keyboard next to me here, I'm not sure if you can see it. That's what that is. I can, plug the audio into something and it makes its own sounds, but I can also use it as a MIDI controller for the computer. And then a workstation has the controller, the module, and the sequencer all in one device. So a sequencer stores musical instructions or MIDI instructions, adds time information to the MIDI info. The original MIDI specification didn't have time. It would send a message that said note on and would send a message that said note off, but nowhere in that message was there any information about how long it lasted. So the note would just play until it got a note off message. So what a sequencer did was it created chunks that had a note on message at the beginning and a note off message at the end. And so you could sort of store this information in a way that could be edited. And it often looked like a multi-track tape paradigm. And now doing it all in computers and digital audio workstations, that very much functions in that multi-track tape sort of way. And we'll have some examples of that coming up. So if you want to use MIDI with a computer, in the old days, you had to have a dedicated MIDI interface. The thing on the left there is a more modern, like USB MIDI interface, but it would take your old school MIDI plugins. A lot of the modern audio interfaces also have MIDI on the back. You see on the right, that Tascam interface has MIDI in and out on the back of it. Most modern MIDI controllers simply have USB ports. So for instance, this controller just has the little mini USB, and you just plug it into your computer via USB. The original MIDI connections were 5-pin DIN connections, the things that look like this. And they had one-way traffic. So if you wanted to send and receive from a device, you needed 2 cables. And there was serial transmission, meaning they sent 1 bit at a time. And, it moved like that would seem fast, but sort of by modern standards, it's a little slow. But the way the messages were put together, the bits had to show up in the right order, or the MIDI device wouldn't really know what to do with them. And we're not going to get super into like pulling apart MIDI messages but it was serial transmission, 1 bit at a time. So a couple of basic message types: channel messages that contain the musical data, system messages, and configuration data. So a type of channel message might be a note message, which contains a key number and a velocity. So the key number, sometimes called the MIDI note number, represents a pitch. All of the MIDI values, most of the MIDI values, range from 0 to 127. And that has to do with how like the numbers that fit in a byte. Because the first bit of the 8-bit byte is a status bit, so it tells you if it's a data, it tells you what part of the message it is, so to speak. So in the other 7 bits, in 7 bits you can represent 128 numbers. So all of the MIDI numbers are like 0 to 127. So velocity is a value between 0 and 127. The key number or note number is a value between 0 and 127. Generally, the note number of 60 is assigned to middle C. Doesn't have to be, but it usually is. And then half steps each way. So if you go 61 is C sharp, 62 is D, 63 is E flat, 64 is E, etc. So this actually becomes a really handy way of notating pitches in integer numbers. And we'll talk about that some more later too. So I'll show you an example in the next video with the controller hooked up of how these note numbers and velocities show up. In 1991, there was an additional specification called General MIDI. And it provides minimum capabilities for General MIDI compliant sound generators. So essentially what it did was it mapped specific program numbers to patch names. And I'm going to get out of this slide here and go look at this web page that I have linked. What we have here is the General MIDI sound set. So these are like the sort of family names. And we go through here. So on every General MIDI compliant device, patch number 1 is acoustic grand piano. 2 is bright acoustic piano. If we come down, 18 is percussive organ. Now, that does not mean that every General MIDI module sounds the same. It just means that every one, voice 8 and, bank 1 is called percussive organ. Or to get to the fun stuff, that 128 is gunshot and 127 is applause and 126 is helicopter, etc. 115 is steel drums. So that doesn't necessarily mean that everything you do is going to sound the same on every device that plays it back. But it does mean that most people are going to make number 7 harpsichord sound kind of like a harpsichord at least. So you get a general idea that things will mostly sound like what you want them to. And we'll, on the in-class portion, do some exercises with that to help clarify those things. Now, MIDI is so ubiquitous that it has been adopted for lots of other things. Lots of alternate controllers that use other instrument paradigms. There's even some audio to MIDI conversion. But we also use MIDI to control things like lights or water fountains or all sorts of stuff. Because if you think about a light show, if you have a message that turns it on and a message that turns it off and a velocity message that gives you a range that you could assign to color, then it's real easy to adjust the color on the lights, turn them on or off, make them brighter, whatever. So this MIDI language has been adopted to a lot of different things. And I'm going to tell a story about that sounds like a name drop, but I promise we'll get back to it. So when I was in high school, I went to Como High School in Lafayette, Louisiana. And there was a girl in my class named Becky Jackson. And Becky had been, like the student council president forever. And Becky's sister worked for David Letterman. This was back, hopefully y'all remember David Letterman, or you'll make me feel very old. But this is back when Letterman was on NBC. Becky's sister Bridget worked for Letterman, and And he would do this thing where he would have staff members come out and talk, because there was some union rule that if you talked on TV, they had to pay you extra money. And Bridget was about to have a baby. So like David would bring her out and talk to her. And it was like sort of his like little way of doing a bonus or whatever. Or at least that's my recollection of the story. So one of these conversations, he asked what was going on back in Lafayette, Louisiana. And she said, oh, well, my little sister's on the homecoming court. So Dave says, hey, everybody at Como High School in Lafayette, if you vote for Becky for homecoming queen, I'll give you each $5. We thought this was really great. One, because we had already voted by the time this came on the air, but two, because we knew that Becky was going to win, because that was Becky. Like, we knew she was going to be the homecoming queen. Anyway, so she was the homecoming queen. We were all expecting our $5 from David Letterman. Well, apparently NBC's lawyers might have told Dave that like you couldn't buy a high school homecoming election, although we had already voted, so he wouldn't really. Or maybe they just found out how big the school was and didn't want to give us each $5. But there was this thing that was originally called the Dancing Waters. And then over some like trademark issues, they changed the name to the Prancing Fluids. But it was this water fountain that sat in front of Letterman's desk. And he would like push the button and turn it on, and Paul would play cheesy music, and the water would squirt up and the lights would flash. And it was a shtick in like 87, 88 around there on Letterman's show. Anyway, so in lieu of giving us each $5, David Letterman gave us the Prancing Fluids, which are probably like Indiana Jones style, locked up in some box at my high school now. But they were like the centerpiece at our senior prom. You walked in and there was like the Prancing Fluids were there. And the way this relates to all of this is the thing that controlled the Prancing Fluids was a MIDI controller.